I was reading the day's news on the computer when I heard a knock on the front door. Since I'm still a city boy at heart, I locked the door when I got home and it took me a minute to open it. The sheriff was standing there, out of breath as he ran from his car to my porch. "There's been an accident, Doc," he said, panting. You'd think that here in Oklahoma, with such a low population and such straight roads, there are very few automobile accidents, but you'd be wrong. Once you get away from the big cities and onto the interstates, our highways turn into narrow two-lane lanes, and too many bridges are in need of repair. But people still drive like they're on an interstate highway, so calling the only doctor for 4 counties to the scene of an accident is not uncommon. "I'll be right there, George. Just get my bag," I said, and started to walk out. "No, Doc," he said, and it was more the odd tone of his voice than his words that made me turn around. "It's Bonnie," he said in a choked tone, and suddenly I noticed the tears on his cheeks. Sam, I felt the epinephrine pumping through my nervous system, and I immediately started to gasp. "Oh my God, where is she?" I demanded. "We have to get there." George just stood still, unable to look at me. "She's gone, Doc. She didn't make it." I've treated quite a few patients with gunshot wounds. They always told me the same thing. The first time you get hit, there's no pain. Your body just goes numb. At that moment, I thought I had been shot in the chest and I staggered, trying to regain my balance as everything around me went numb. "No, this can't be happening," I screamed. "I can save her if I get there in time." But when I tried to get around him and run toward the police car, George grabbed me and held me back. "You can't leave, Doc. You can't see her." "That was bad, Doc. Really bad. I'm so sorry," he said through tears. The rest of that night passed like a blur. Phone calls, quiet voices, people coming and going, small conversations through radios filled with static. The only thing I remember is the nervous deputy sheriff who stayed with me after George had to leave. And I also remember that, like a gunshot wound, once the numbness began to pass, the pain became unbearable. Once that horrible night when the agony became too much, I reached into my medical bag and pulled out a vial of morphine. When the deputy wasn't looking, I administered the injection and then lay on the bed. Oblivion came quickly and mercifully, just as I had hoped. I know it was cowardly of me, but I just couldn't stay awake any longer that night. When I woke up, I immediately smelled food, jumped out of the bedroom and stared in amazement at the many plates and plastic containers on the kitchen counters. Then my brain shook off the last remnants of morphine, and I suddenly realized why my roommates had brought so much food. "Oh, Bonnie," I exclaimed, collapsing into the nearest chair. I had only delayed the pain. There was no relief now. George returned later that morning and tried to answer the questions he knew I had. She was driving down State Highway 296, coming back from the office in Arrow Point after work, he told me. "We think she must have fallen asleep at the wheel because her Honda crossed the center line and hit an oncoming truck. The truck driver didn't survive either." I tried desperately not to imagine what the scene of the accident looked like. The next few days passed in an incoherent fog of emotional pain, brightened only by the few memories that stayed with me. Perhaps the scariest of these was meeting Bonnie's father at the funeral home. He was a big man, as tall as I was, and surprisingly trim after working on the ranch, even in his 60s. But when I saw him that day, I thought he had aged about 10 years. When he entered the parlor, he hunched over and took small, feeble steps. When he saw me, he came over and hugged me. "I'm so sorry," he managed to mutter before bursting into tears. I clung to him tightly, my own tears wetting the shoulder of his suit. Everyone around me stopped, awkward and confused, not knowing what to do. Finally, he led me over to her coffin. Of course, I had seen hundreds of corpses, but now I was terribly anxious to see my wife. The coffin was partially closed so that only her face was visible. We all knew why, but no one wanted to talk about it. "This isn't Bonnie," I thought to myself as I looked at her embalmed face. The Bonnie I knew was full of laughter and joie de vivre. The face lying there resembled a poorly painted portrait. "Oh, Bonnie," I thought, fumbling for my handkerchief, "why did you have to go? Why couldn't it have been me?" When I first moved to Millersville, I was a bachelor, and it seemed that every family in town was eager to introduce me to their eligible daughters at the first opportunity. I was invited to so many Sunday dinners, church functions, family picnics, and high school soccer games that I could barely keep track of them all. And at each of them, somewhere along the way I was introduced to one or more daughters, ranging from 40-year-olds, I would assume, To 16-year-olds, God forbid. It would be nice to think that my good looks and persuasive personality made me such a desirable prey, but anyone who went to medical school knows that doctors have an advantage when it comes to socializing with the opposite sex. The combination of high incomes, comfortable lifestyles, and respected positions in society make us hot matrimonial prospects. It used to be said that a doctor who can't find a spouse is a doctor who doesn't want one. But what all these potential spouses may not know is that we physicians have been warned about the chase and advised not to fall into the trap, at least until we find Mr. or Miss Right. So I was polite and friendly to the young girls of Millersville and even dated some of them a few times. But I tried to behave very properly and control my animal impulses, even when several young ladies quite frankly offered me their charms. The last thing I wanted was to have angry parents on my hands in a town where the #1 truck accessory was a gun rack. I was so careful that one of my patients told me he heard an upset girl say she thought I was gay. I just smiled, assured him I wasn't, and took my time. And then I met Bonnie. I drove 50 miles to Arrow Point to visit the government office there. When I entered the reception area, she was working behind the counter. Have you ever walked under an overcast sky and suddenly found yourself in the sunlight? That's exactly what I felt when I saw her. I don't think I stumbled as I approached the counter, but I'm not sure because my brain was definitely not in control of my body or, as it quickly became clear, my mouth. I came to see Mr. Rogers. I babbled. I know who you are, she growled. Then she swiveled around in her chair and rudely stepped away from me. I had no idea what I might have offended her with, but I was determined to find out and fix it. A week later, I made an appointment to see Mr. Rogers again. When I walked into the lobby, she rolled her eyes in disgust when she saw me. When I showed up again the next week, she looked at me in surprise. "Why are you here? Mr. Rogers has the day off today," she said. "I didn't come here to see him," I told her. "I was hoping you would have lunch with me." "So, you traveled 50 miles just to have lunch with me?" she asked in amazement. Blushing, I nodded. She rolled her eyes again. "Well, okay," she said reluctantly. And so it began. I was surprised to learn that she was Richard Miller's daughter. I would have thought the head of the county commission would want to brag about his only daughter like other leading figures in the county, and maybe that was the case. But Bonnie, I realized, had an independent character and it wasn't easy to change her mind. I know, because I courted her for over 6 months, only to have her start dating me seriously. Besides, even after the wedding, she refused to leave her job at Arrow Point. She informed me that she had achieved her position on her own, without her father's influence, and was proud of the accomplishment. I agreed as if I had a choice, but now wished with all my heart that she didn't have to travel 50 miles every day. For all her independence, when we got engaged, Bonnie was surprisingly conservative sexually. Sexual intercourse was ruled out until after the wedding, as she had explicitly informed me. I thought her position was terribly old-fashioned even for rural Oklahoma, but there was nothing I could do to change her mind. Besides, by then I was so deeply in love with her that it ceased to matter. On our honeymoon, I took her to the Virgin Islands, and in a secluded hotel on St. Croix, we had our first sexual intercourse. It wasn't the first time for Bonnie, which surprised me, but I chose not to ask and she didn't bother to explain. I remember the last night before we had to leave the island. We were doing it, after which she went out on the balcony to look at the ocean. When I approached her, the moonlight highlighted the tears in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" I asked anxiously. She turned and pressed her face against me. "This whole thing has been so hard for me," she whispered. "I'll never forget it as long as I live." Tears of happiness seemed to come to my eyes. Now, in the funeral home, similar memories never left me, and I was powerless to ward them off, even though they caused so much pain. In medical school, they teach you to sympathize with patients, but never to empathize. Empathy is important, they said, but if you start sharing your patient's emotions, your effectiveness as a doctor will decrease. Besides, you might go crazy carrying around all that grief. As one by one people passed through the waiting room to express their sympathy, I clearly realized how little comfort their words brought me. "We are so sorry for your loss," I heard, and realized that their grief was no comparison to my own. "She was such a devoted wife," they said, and I realized they had no idea how devoted she was. "She's in a better place," someone said, but all I could think about was that it certainly wasn't better for me. Finally, we were all standing at the grave as the Baptist preacher spoke the last words before her casket was lowered into the rich brown earth for eternity. Trying to suppress tears, I looked around at the other mourners. Of all of them, I thought, the only one who had experienced her loss as much as I had was her father. The old man was supported by Richard Jr. His reddened eyes stayed fixed on the spot where the remains of his only daughter rested. When the burial was over, the crowd began to disperse. I heard one of the county commissioners say, "I hope Richard will be okay." Bonnie was a real daddy's girl. She was willing to do anything for him, and he wanted everything for her. Losing her like this could get him killed. I looked back at her father, who was walking away from the grave, and thought that the commissioner's fears might well be correct. Given my own agony, I wondered if losing her would kill me as well. An elderly woman came up to me and patted my arm. "I hope you're not going to leave us now," she added. Before I could speak, her husband called out to her. "Martha, what nonsense are you talking about? Of course Dr. Robertson isn't going to leave Millersville." I wasn't even thinking about leaving. In fact, I wasn't thinking about anything at all except getting through Bonnie's funeral. Anyway, it seemed like an odd remark to make, especially at a time like this. But it reminded me of how I'd ended up in Millersville in the first place. I always wanted to be a doctor. It's funny, I don't remember what sparked my interest in medicine, but whenever I was asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, I always answered, a doctor. When you are young, all professions seem the same and all careers seem equally attainable. Over time, you begin to realize the complex interweaving of intelligence, skills, interests, abilities, and a dozen other factors that are necessary for a successful career in any profession. And when all these factors are sorted, there is one last barrier: the cost of training. Few professions cost more than medicine. Putting pencil to paper, I decided that by the time I was ready to start practicing, I would have about $250,000 in debt. As if that wasn't enough, my father's heart attack while I was in college dealt my hopes for a medical career a seemingly fatal blow. But this is a great country, and it has a great program to address this problem: the National Health Service Corps. The NHSC was created to address two problems. The first is overspecialization. Every medical student knows that there is a lot of money to be made by specializing. As a consequence, we have a shortage of physicians in less lucrative general fields such as internal medicine, family practice, pediatrics, etc. The second, and in some ways even more pressing problem, is the shortage of doctors in underserved rural areas of the country. Go to Manhattan, and it's hard to walk a block there without tripping over a doctor. If you go to the central part of the country, you have to drive a day or more to find a doctor. The NHSC told me that if I agreed to become a primary care physician and was willing to move to an underserved area, Uncle Sam would forgive the mountains of debt I would accumulate, provided I stayed in the area for the long haul. Thus, I made early commitments that allowed me to get the support I needed during medical school, internship, and residency. In essence, I sold my first few years of practice to NHSC in exchange for tuition and expenses. It was a compromise I was quite willing to make. I wouldn't get rich, but I could fulfill my dream at a place that really needed my services. I happily signed up. It was in my second year of residency training that Oklahoma became a possible place for me to work. I had never been to Oklahoma before, and the idea seemed romantic. Would it be difficult to spend the next few years seeing patients among the swaying wheat, corn as tall as an elephant's eyes, and prairies where brave pioneers made their homes? That's how I ended up in Millersville. When I met Richard Miller, head of the Miller County Commission, he made it clear that there was much more in store for his city than 4 years of working with me. His family had lived here in north-central Oklahoma since the Great Land Rush of 1889, which explains the name of both the county and the city. Richard wanted the town preserved for his son and grandchildren. There was another NHSC doctor in Millersville a few years ago, but he didn't stay long. For Millersville's leadership, it was a disaster. A town without a doctor is a dying town, Richard told me. Couples are afraid to start families, people are starting to drift away from each other, and the town is slowly declining. We don't want that to happen here. They certainly made it easy for me. The office was already waiting for me, and I was surprised at how well equipped it was. But before I had time to be impressed with my new office, Richard showed me the house I was to live in for free. It was a beautiful two-story Victorian house, recently renovated. And when I objected that it was too big for my needs, Richard just smiled and said that I would grow into it in time. I was attracted not only to the great privileges they provided, but to all the little ways they made me feel wanted. The day I enrolled at Millersville, I became a celebrity. Everyone in town seemed to know and love me, and everyone made an effort to nod and smile as they passed me on the street. The county commissioners began to consult me on all sorts of matters and never ceased to praise my parsimonious advice. Overnight, I went from an underachieving medical student to a very important person. Of course, I understood what they were trying to do, create every possible incentive for me to stay there, even after my obligations to NHSC were fulfilled. So when they started introducing me to their daughters, I was under no illusions. The good parents at Millersville knew that the bonds of marriage would be far stronger than any other incentives they could offer to get me to stay. But while all of this was obvious, I couldn't help but be swayed by the sincerity of the people, their obvious warmth, trust, and affection. Of course, they needed me to stay, but I also believed that they were genuinely glad it was me and not someone else, and that felt good. And when I met Bonnie, all other considerations took a back seat. The fact that I'd fallen in love with the only young woman in town who didn't throw herself at me somehow reassured me. Her restraint convinced me that when she finally agreed to a permanent relationship with me, I had truly won her over. When she finally agreed to be my bride, all doubts about me staying in Millersville were put to rest. When we finally got married, I realized that life couldn't get any better for me. Until that night when everything went to hell. For the next week after the funeral, food kept showing up at my house. I knew it was the traditional way to express my concern, but I was touched nonetheless. It was as if my friends and neighbors wanted me to have food that they feared I would not be able to provide for myself during my grieving period. This simple act meant so much more than ritualized words of condolence. After the funeral, I took a week's vacation and all my appointments were magically rescheduled. This was fortunate because I couldn't work with patients, but I was not inactive. I realized that death entailed an unexpectedly long list of details to think about, and I diligently pursued them. Each item was excruciatingly painful, but I wanted to get rid of these razor-sharp reminders as soon as possible so they wouldn't continue to plague me. One of the last items on my list was a visit to the sheriff's office. It was obvious George wasn't happy to see me, but he invited me to sit in the chair across from his desk. Dr. Robertson. Mark, are you sure you want to go through with this? The more details you find out, the harder it will be for you. Thank you, George, but I have to find out what happened. I can't heal until I know. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair and crossed his arms. Like I said, we can't know exactly what happened. We're guessing she must have dozed off behind the wheel because the road where the accident occurred is straight and level. Her car crossed the center line and did not hit the brakes. She did not hit the brakes because there were no skid marks on the highway. We estimate they were both traveling at about 65 miles per hour. I shuddered. The kinetic energy of such a collision would have been catastrophic. Go on, I said. What about Bonnie? He didn't take his eyes off his papers. She was buckled up, and the airbag deployed as it should have. But at the speed they were traveling at, the passenger compartment partially crumpled, and she was pinned in the wreckage. I tried desperately not to think about what it looked like. My beautiful wife shattered like a bird flying into a glass window. But I should have known better. So she was trapped in the car with multiple injuries. Do we know what killed her? Was it shock? I asked in a whisper. George lowered his head even further. Somehow her left arm was severed in the accident. She bled out, Doc. He paused. If it helps, it must have been very quick. A diagram from anatomy class came to mind, and I saw the brachial artery branching off the carotid artery and traveling down the arm. No, I thought, this won't take long. What about the other car? I asked. It was a Dodge pickup. The driver must have died instantly. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Who was he? I asked. His name was Taylor Johnson. He was a rancher in Noble County, east of here. His wife said he was hunting whitetails on the Black Kettle Wildlife Refuge. He must have been on his way home when the accident happened. I shook my head. That name meant nothing to me. One last thing, George, I said. I'd like to see the autopsy report. Doc, are you sure? Please, I said. I'm a doctor. It's the only way I can make sense of the situation. He stood up and walked over to an old metal file cabinet. Automation was not yet widespread in this part of Oklahoma. "It's just part of the case, Doc," he explained. "There wasn't much doubt about the cause of death." I glanced at the report. George was right. The coroner had only visually examined the body. The loss of the left arm was there, as I'd expected, but it was painful to learn of the numerous broken ribs and cracked sternum. Although the report didn't mention them, I knew without a doubt that she must have extensive internal injuries. Then there was the skull fracture. The hip and pelvic fractures were incidental. All in all, half a dozen potentially fatal wounds. But the severed brachial artery ensured that by the time the volunteer EMT got to her, she'd be gone. Strangely, I felt a little better after reading the report. I figured she probably passed out from the blow to her skull. If that was the case, she wasn't hurt at all. That was a small blessing. Another consolation was the realization that there was nothing I could do to help her, even if I had managed to get to the crash site. I doubt she would have survived if she'd been in an accident in front of a major metropolitan hospital. I handed the sheet back to George and headed home. In a strange way, the autopsy report gave me a greater sense of closure than her funeral. The next week, I went back to work. There was nothing more I could do for Bonnie, so I decided it was time to try to do something for the living. Thursday afternoon, my schedule was free late, and I was amazed when my nurse came to tell me that Hillary Johnson was in the waiting room and wanted to see me. A quick check of our files showed that she hadn't come in before, so I pulled out a blank form to prepare for the exam. A rather attractive woman about my age walked into the office. I invited her to sit in the chair next to the examination table, but she continued to stand with her arms crossed, looking at me intently. Her manner struck me as a little unsettling, but I tried to begin the examination. "What can I do for you today, Mrs. Johnson?" I asked in my usual manner. She dropped her hands and clenched her fists, and her face began to redden. "You can tell me why your wife killed my husband," she whispered, and then she covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Oh my God, I thought, this must be the wife of the man who was driving the pickup truck. Some part of me wanted to go around the table and comfort her, and another wanted to hide in the face of her obvious pain. But her words reminded me of my own pain, and there was nothing I could do but sit there as if paralyzed. After a long few minutes, she seemed to regain control of herself, and at the same time, I snapped out of the fog of memories that had enveloped me. I spoke first. "I'm very sorry about your husband, Mrs. Johnson. I'm still trying to come to terms with my own loss." Her expression softened a little, as she seemed to realize that I was suffering too, but she clearly continued to be tormented. I just don't understand how she could have been so careless. If she had just stopped and taken a nap, just stopped for a little rest. "I don't understand it either," I told her sincerely. "She drove every night at the same time. I keep thinking about it, wishing she'd called me to come get her. Anything but what happened." I tried, but I couldn't contain the anguish in my voice. Mrs. Johnson must have picked up on this because her tone softened even more. "I know it wasn't your fault. If you're honest with yourself, it probably wasn't her fault either. I was just in a lot of pain and I felt like I had to come. Now I wish I hadn't. I can see how much you're hurting too." "It's okay, Mrs. Johnson," I said. "We're both looking for answers where there are only questions. We're both looking for a way to reverse what happened, even though we know we can't do it. It's human nature to be angry at everyone involved, even if he or she was powerless to prevent the tragedy." Then my professional education took over. "Were you able to sleep after the accident?" I asked softly. "Softly," I asked. "Softly," I asked. "Gently," I asked. When she shook her head, I quickly wrote a prescription for her. "If you want, you can take one of these medications before bed. Just don't wash them down with alcohol." She thanked me and got up to leave after I handed her the prescription. Before leaving, I asked her, "Please stay in touch, Mrs. Johnson. I'd like to know how you're doing." She nodded gratefully, and after she left, I felt better that I had been able to help, even if only a little. But for the next few days, I was constantly reminded of her visit. Her questions kept me going, even though I knew there were no answers. Sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason. But knowing that doesn't mean accepting it, and the fact that I couldn't answer any of Mrs. Johnson's questions was even harder to accept. If nothing had happened, I think time would have gradually begun to heal me, but I couldn't afford that luxury. A week later, Miss Nicole Claiborne from some insurance company in Oklahoma City made an appointment for me. She made it clear that her visit was not a sales call, but she didn't reveal her purpose in advance. She merely said that she needed to speak with me regarding my late wife. I reluctantly agreed to meet with her, ready for my wounds to reopen. When Miss Claiborne arrived at the appointed time, I saw an attractive young woman dressed in a business suit that might have been considered conservative if not for the slit in the skirt rising higher than I expected. I found it somewhat offensive that she wore such an outfit to meet a man still mourning his wife, and I tried to keep my attention at eye level. "Dr. Robertson," she began, "I'm here because your wife was covered under a life insurance policy her father purchased for her. You are listed as the beneficiary. Were you aware of that?" "No," I told her. "I had no idea." Miss Claiborne nodded. "There was a double indemnity clause in the policy that goes into effect in the event of accidental death. In this particular case, the face value of the policy was $100,000, so the payout, if the claim is successful, would be $200,000. She stared at me intently as she spoke. When I didn't respond in any way, she continued. "Naturally, as part of our normal procedure in such cases, we routinely review all premature deaths before we pay out a claim." "I don't see what there is to investigate," I told her coldly. "The police told me she must have fallen asleep at the wheel before the accident. I don't see anything more straightforward than that." She sat like that for a few moments, then defiantly crossed her legs, unbuttoning her skirt. I ignored her demonstration. $200,000 is a lot of money. What are you going to do with it?" she asked sharply. I was angry at this woman for her inappropriate demonstration and the tone of her questions. I was also angry at myself for the tears that came to my eyes, despite my attempts to maintain my composure. Miss Claiborne, the woman I loved, died horribly in an accident just a few weeks ago. Money is the last thing on my mind. If you have no further questions, would you please leave me alone?" She spread her legs and sat upright in the chair, carefully adjusting her skirt to hide what she had so eagerly displayed only a few minutes ago. Her whole demeanor changed and an apologetic expression appeared on her face. "Dr. Robertson, I am very sorry for my questions and the way I have behaved. Please accept my sincere apologies." She must have seen the confusion on my face because she hurried to continue. "Dr. Robertson, I've been doing insurance investigations longer than you think. In that time, I've learned to use certain distractions." She reached down and smoothed the slit in her skirt to help me evaluate the people I deal with. Some of them turned out not to be who they said they were, and their reactions to my distractions helped me uncover the truth. In your case, I became convinced that you were a grief-stricken widower who genuinely loved his late wife, and I am truly sorry for your loss. "I guess I understand," I said slowly. "But why would you even want to involve me in all this? Surely there can be no doubt about what happened." Even as I spoke, I remembered Hillary Johnson's visit and felt uneasy. The investigator leaned toward me. "Dr. Robertson, another thing I've learned on this job is to rely on my intuition. My intuition tells me that you're a good man who wants to know the truth about what happened to his wife, so I'm going to be very frank with you. But first, let me warn you. By necessity, I will have to consider possibilities that are troubling. If I suggest anything that offends you, please hear me out. I did not know your wife, so my questions are ones I would ask any person in similar circumstances. Please don't take any of this personally." I nodded doubtfully. Logically, an investigator should look at a situation from all angles, but in this case, I still couldn't see more than one angle. She quickly showed me how wrong I was. "Dr. Robertson, I told you I listened to my intuition. My intuition keeps asking how your late wife could have fallen asleep at the wheel before the accident. I don't think she did." I was shocked. If she didn't fall asleep, what else could have caused her to swerve into an oncoming truck? "Are you suggesting she might have been drugged?" I asked incredulously. "Absolutely not," she answered quickly. "On the contrary, I don't think she was in any condition." I looked at her curiously. "How do you know that?" asked I. Perhaps she had a very hard day's work and was unusually exhausted. Maybe she hadn't eaten anything for lunch and her blood sugar suddenly dropped. There are lots of things that could have caused her to faint right before the accident. "When was the last time you were at Arrow Point?" she asked. "A long time ago," I answered. "A few months at least." "I don't know exactly." She nodded. 2 months ago, Miller County took on the repair of the bridge over the river between Arrow Point and Millersville. The repairs require any vehicle traveling over the bridge to slow down to 35 miles per hour and then make an abrupt lane change in the middle of the bridge. Your wife had to be alert and attentive to drive over that bridge. That doesn't mean she couldn't have fallen asleep after crossing the bridge, I protested. It's not impossible, she admitted, but the accident happened only a mile from the bridge. At the speed she was traveling at, it was only about 60 seconds. I don't think she could have fallen asleep within a minute of successfully changing speed and correcting her steering. I sat in silence. Bonnie made this trip every night after work. She had to be used to driving in these conditions, and I wondered again what could have gone wrong after all these years. What Nicole Claiborne told me was extremely disturbing. What about a mechanical failure? I asked finally. Could something like a bump or a steering problem have caused her car to swerve into the other lane? Yes, it could have, she replied calmly. But I had already gone to the junkyard to inspect your wife's car. The tires were intact, and the damage to the suspension and steering didn't seem to be related to the accident. But maybe, I began as she raised her hand. More importantly, she continued, we were able to retrieve the onboard computer from her car, which recorded exactly what happened in the last few seconds before the collision. As her Honda was traveling at 64.8 miles per hour, the steering wheel was turned to the left, causing the car to skid into the other lane. The steering wheel was then straightened. The brakes were not applied. I leaned back in my chair with my mouth open. It all sounded like Bonnie had intentionally steered her Honda into an oncoming truck. How could it have been an accident? But if it wasn't an accident, the only other possibility was suicide. But she had no reason to commit suicide, at least I didn't think so. Miss Claiborne's voice broke through my thoughts. Did you or your wife know Taylor Johnson? She asked softly. I never heard of him before the accident, I answered her. And I never heard Bonnie speak of him. Besides, as I understand it, he lived in Noble County, east of here, so it's not likely she met him. Why do you ask? Now her face looked tired. You won't like it, but there are other possibilities I have to consider. What if the accident wasn't an accident? What if she was deliberately trying to kill not only Jason Taylor, but herself as well? The thought took my breath away. That can't be. I sighed. Why would she do that? I can think of at least 3 possibilities, she said quietly. She raised her hand and squeezed her index finger. First, Taylor Johnson was a mortal enemy, and she felt she had to give her life to protect her family from that threat. She touched her middle finger. The second option is that she and Mr. Johnson were lovers, and she killed him and herself in a fit of jealousy. Lifting up her ring finger and looking away, she added, or if they were lovers, she could have been trying to make sure no one found out she was pregnant by him. I tried to be calm and reasonable, but her last assumption was too serious. Damn it, that's not true. Bonnie loved me and she wasn't pregnant. What do you want? To exhume her body and do a full autopsy? I won't stand for that. She quickly walked over and knelt down in front of me, taking my hands in hers. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. I'm not your enemy. And I don't like that I have to be so cynical and suspicious of people. Please forgive me. Although her suggestions were outrageous, her apology tempered my anger. Okay, Miss Claiborne, I think you're just doing your job. Still remorseful, she looked up at me. Please, call me Nicole. May I call you Mark? If we're going to find out what really happened, it would help. Okay, Nicole, I said, but I still think you're wrong about Bonnie. If anything, I agree. I don't think any of those 3 scenarios are correct. First, all 3 require Bonnie to know that Taylor Johnson will be on the highway at that exact time. However, Mrs. Taylor told me that she had no idea when her husband would return from hunting. As for Bonnie, she had left Arrow Point at her usual time, so she obviously hadn't made any special arrangements to meet Johnson. Furthermore, I checked her cell phone records and she didn't make or receive any calls in the last few hours before the incident, so I don't see how she could have coordinated their meeting. So it was just a coincidence, a chance meeting? I asked. Maybe, Nicole admitted, but that still leaves us with what looks like a deliberate attempt to crash into Johnson's truck. Maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way. Could Taylor Johnson have wanted to kill Bonnie? I asked. I've thought about that, she told me. But how could he have encouraged her to steer her car into his lane? She stood up. Mark, I know I've upset you, and I apologize again. But the fact is, there's nothing about this case that isn't clear to me, and I can't let it go without looking a little deeper. I sank back in my chair. Miss Claiborne, Nicole, I have to admit that I've had my own doubts since the accident. I need to know what happened too. She held out a business card to me. If you remember anything that might shed light on any of this, please call me anytime. She looked at me sympathetically. Call me, even if you just need someone to talk to. Then she turned and walked out of my office. I had thought I was in turmoil before. Now the thought that my late wife had taken some mysterious secret with her to the grave was a new wound that had yet to heal. It was enough that Bonnie had died in a tragic accident. The questions Nicole was asking filled my mind with insidious suspicions. Of course, none of these scenarios could be true, but the multitude of unanswered questions was enough to induce paranoia. That night before going to bed, I took one of my own sleeping pills. The next day was Saturday, and my office was closed on Saturday afternoon. After taking my last patient for the day, I got in my car and drove to Arrow Point. Up until now, I had avoided the place because I couldn't bear to see the place where my beautiful Bonnie's life had been cut short. However, now I felt that I had no choice but to check things out with my own eyes and try to understand what had happened as best I could. Although I had been living in Oklahoma for almost 2 years now, I still hadn't gotten used to the distance. Bonnie hadn't given much thought to the fact that she commuted from Millersville to Arrow Point and back every day for work. It wasn't unusual for her, but for me it would have been a real burden. I guess growing up on the prairie, one's perspective changes. But if this trail was so ordinary for her, I thought, what was different about that terrible night? What could have led her to her death on that long, straight stretch of highway? I deliberately ignored the spot where I calculated the accident had occurred and drove on to Arrow Point. I wanted to make the return trip the same way she did, so I pulled into Bonnie's office, made a U-turn in the parking lot, and got back on the highway. After a while, I pulled up to the bridge and was immediately convinced that Nicole was right. No one could safely speed through the repair work here. Unless you were fully awake and alert, you would likely crash into one of the concrete barriers as you changed lanes. As soon as I hit the bridge, I pressed down on the gas pedal and accelerated to 65. I checked my watch and noted on the odometer when 60 seconds had passed. Then I stopped, made sure the road was clear, and made another U-turn to get back to the crash site. It seemed to me that it would be very difficult to fall asleep in such a short time. Pulling over to the side of the road, I got out of the car and started looking around. Apparently, the tow truck drivers had done a good job. The only evidence of the accident was shards of broken glass and plastic, and a few strips of chrome body molding. Then something caught my eye in the grass, and as I approached it, I found a small wooden cross with the inscription, Bonnie Miller, deceased, and the date. I don't know who erected this cross, but when I saw it, all I could think of was the girl I had met at Arrow Point. Again, tears burned my eyes. After a while, I pulled myself together and with a heavy heart made the return trip to Millersville. After viewing the wreck site, I missed Bonnie more than ever, and at the same time I was more anxious than ever. I was now certain that much of what I had believed about her accident could not be true. "Oh, Bonnie, what happened?" I asked helplessly. For the next 2 weeks, I obsessively reviewed the trip to Arrow Point and back. I wasn't sure if I was paying tribute to my wife or looking for clues to solve the mystery, but I found nothing to help in either search. After several fruitless trips, I decided I had to do something different. Driving up to the office where Bonnie worked, I parked, went inside, and asked permission to speak to Mr. Rogers, her supervisor. When I gave my name, he appeared very quickly. I guess being the only doctor in 4 counties is also a privilege. Mr. Rogers offered his condolences and then over a cup of bad coffee chatted with me about Bonnie and her work. He must have been trying to suck up to me because he kept praising her as an employee. "She was great," he enthused. "We'd love to have her full-time, but I don't think a doctor's wife needs those hours," he added with satisfaction. I stared at him. I thought Bonnie had a full-time job. Trying to hide my surprise, I asked him, "Refresh my memory, Mr. Rogers. How many hours a week did she work here?" "Monday through Friday, 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., every evening, 20 hours a week," he muttered. "She cut her hours down to half-time just before your wedding. I think she wanted to spend more time with you together in the mornings," he said with a wink. Then he remembered he was talking about a dead woman and, stammering, apologized. I brushed off his apology, thanked him for his help, and then headed home with a queasy feeling in my stomach. Bonnie was always protective of her work. I told her repeatedly that she didn't need to work, but she insisted. "I need my own money in case you kick me out," she'd say with a laugh. And I thought it was another example of how strong her independent nature was. Now it seemed like something else, but I didn't know what it was. When I got home, I immediately reached into the drawer where her bank statements were kept. She kept her own checking account and used it to pay for gas, meals at work, and other incidental expenses. I had always admired that she wanted to be at least partially financially independent of me. Now I thought there must be more to the story. Her bank statements confirmed what Rogers had told me. Every month, I saw that her paycheck was automatically deposited into her account. I checked the statements for the last 2 years. Shortly before we were married, Bonnie's paycheck had been cut in half. She never said anything to me about it. I thought I'd find some explanation when I looked through her canceled checks, but I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. So what was going on? I felt very tired as I walked back to my desk. Finding her business card, I called Nicole's cell phone. "This is Mark Robertson, Nicole. I don't know what's going on, but I think you're up to something." And I told her what I had found, and she promised to get back to Millersville as soon as she could. Before she hung up, she said, "Don't do anything rash, Mark. Wait until I get there, please." Now I had even more questions than before, and there was no one but Nicole to discuss them with. All I knew for sure was that Bonnie was keeping secrets from me, and while I didn't know what those secrets were, none of my assumptions were very pretty. The day after the last meeting, I got back in the car and headed to Arrow Point. I had no idea what I wanted to accomplish, but I felt I had to do something. The news I'd learned the day before was like a worm lodged in my brain, and I just couldn't sit still and let it dig aimlessly into my brain. The trip to Arrow Point went without much incident, but as I stopped at an intersection preparing to head back to Millersville, I heard someone calling my name. "Hey Doc, Doc Robertson, can you give me a ride?" I turned around in my seat and saw Jared Porter waving his arms and running in my direction. Jared was one of my patients, a healthy teenager from a good family. "What are you doing in Arrow Point, Jared?" I asked as he climbed into the front seat next to me. "And where's your car?" He smiled broadly. "I'm dating a girl who lives here in Arrow Point. My car's in for repairs, and she called and said she was lonely and I gave her a ride." "You know how it is when you miss your woman," he grinned. Then he suddenly realized what he had said, and his face went pale. "Oh my God, Doc, I'm so sorry. I was talking about my girlfriend. I wasn't thinking about Mrs." He fell silent in embarrassment. "It's okay, Jared," I said softly. "I'm just glad I could give you a ride. Your mom would be worried if you got stuck on the highway." He nodded awkwardly, grateful to be spared any further awkwardness. As I drove, we chatted about school and his future plans. He made it clear that he wanted to leave Millersville at the earliest opportunity. "There's nothing here for me," he declared. "I hope to go to OU and live in Norman or Okeechobee City after graduation." "You're not thinking of going back to Millersville?" I asked. "Absolutely not," he replied confidently. "All my friends think the same." While we were talking, I looked in my rearview mirror and noticed a truck quickly overtaking me. Soon I saw it pull into the left lane to go around me. The teenager behind the wheel looked to be the same age as Jared and waved affably as he passed us. I didn't feel so friendly. The speed of my car was 10 miles per hour over the legal speed limit, and the other truck easily passed me anyway. A peculiarity of Oklahoma roads is that on many stretches you can see them for miles, and I saw another car in the distance coming toward us. To my horror, the truck that had just passed us suddenly veered into the oncoming lane. A moment later, the oncoming car did the same thing, pulling into my lane, so they both passed each other in oncoming lanes at 70 miles per hour. The car then got back into its own lane, and as it passed me on my left, I saw the girl's smirking face. As I watched the events unfold, I instinctively let off the gas and applied the brakes. With my heart pounding in my chest, I pulled over to the side of the road. Hearing Jared laughing beside me, I angrily turned to face him. "What the hell was that?" I demanded. Who, he exclaimed. "The heart of the prairie." "What are you talking about, Jared? Those two people just didn't die." "No, they were fine. Didn't you see them stick their hands out the window?" he asked. He raised his left arm above his head in an arc, bending the hand at the wrist and pointing it down toward his head at a 45-degree angle. I stared at him dumbly. "Don't you get it?" he asked. He scribbled the following on the dashboard. One driver's left arm goes this way, the other driver's arm goes the same way. Put them together, and you get a heart, the heart of the prairie. I looked at him in amazement. Do all people really do that every time they pass each other on the highway? Oh no, he answered quickly. Not all people, just sweethearts. It's a way of saying I love you. For the rest of the ride, I didn't say anything more to Jared. I couldn't. I was in shock. It was late when I dropped Jared off at his parents' house. When I pulled up to my house, there was a rental car parked out front and Nicole Claiborne waiting inside with the window rolled down. When she saw me, she smiled broadly, held out a package and said, I brought dinner with me. Then she saw the look on my face and her smile disappeared. As she set the food on the dining table and we began to pick at our plates, I started to talk about what I had witnessed that day and what Jared had told me. She shook her head in disgust. Never underestimate how stupid people can be, she said. Then a light bulb went on in her head. Oh my God, so that's what happened to Bonnie, she exclaimed. She deliberately drove into the other lane, expecting an oncoming driver to make the same maneuver. Exactly, I said. Only the other driver didn't know it. Because he was the wrong person, she finished my thought. Then she shuddered. That explains what happened to Bonnie's arm, she said, and I couldn't help but imagine what would have happened to the arm in the window in an accident at that speed. I brushed that picture aside and continued. But if Taylor Johnson isn't the right person, then who is? I asked. Nicole beat me to it. That's the wrong question, she said. The real question is, why would Bonnie think it's the right person? We stared at each other. The truck! We shouted out at the same time. Taylor Johnson was driving the truck that Bonnie thought she recognized, Nicole continued, panting. She wanted to give her lover a sign, the heart of the prairie. Only it wasn't him. She shook her head sadly. It was all just a terrible mistake, a stupid accident that shouldn't have happened. When Nicole said the word lover, I felt the pain again, but now a new emotion rose up in me. Anger. But I suppressed the feeling because I needed to know more. So how can we find out who Bonnie knew who drove a truck like Taylor Johnson's? I asked. I'll have to find out from the Department of Motor Vehicles, she said, and went to get her iPad. When she returned, she was already checking the database. Okay, she said. I found the registration number for Taylor Johnson's truck. All that's left to do is see if it matches any other trucks in the area. Good luck with that, I said cynically. Everyone here and his brother has a pickup truck. That's true, she said, but we're looking for one that Bonnie might recognize from afar. What distinctive feature would make her think she was driving past her lover's pickup? I tried to think logically, not emotionally. It has to be the color, I said. She smiled at me like I was the smartest student in her class. Exactly, she said. And guess what? Taylor Johnson's truck was painted yellow, which isn't a color you see very often these days. In fact, according to the DMV, there's only one yellow pickup truck of that make and model in Miller County, and it's registered to one Holden Calloway. Who's that? I asked dumbly. Let me check another database and I might be able to tell you, she replied. After a moment, she looked at me triumphantly. According to this database, it's a 28-year-old male living in Arrow Point. Damn, that's Bonnie's age, I said. Give me a minute. I think I know where to find something that might help us. I hid in the attic and, after rummaging around there for a while, came back with the book in my hands. I held it out to Nicole. It's Bonnie's high school yearbook, I said quietly. While she held it in her lap, I flipped through the pages, moving to pictures of high school seniors and working my way down the list until I found a picture of Holden Calloway. From it, a good-looking slender boy with ridiculous hair and an ill-fitting suit was staring back at us. So? She asked, looking at the picture. I turned another page and ran my finger across it until I reached Bonnie's picture. Even though she looked so young, I could still see the woman she was about to become. But that wasn't what caught Nicole's attention. Underneath her picture, the following words were scrawled in ballpoint pen. I love you, Bonnie. Heart of the Prairie forever Holden. They were high school sweethearts, Nicole whispered. Maybe it didn't end in high school, I said. Nicole looked up at me. But something still feels weird to me. I could understand if Bonnie was dating Holden Calloway at Arrow Point, but why would she expect to pass him on her way back from Millersville? Nah, she set aside the high school yearbook and picked up the iPad again. When she looked at me again, her eyes widened. I don't understand. This can't be true, she said. It says here that Holden's employer is the Miller Ranch. We talked for a long time more that night. We had learned so many new things, but there were even more questions whose answers seemed tantalizingly out of reach. I sank down on the couch, my head beginning to split, and turned to Nicole. I'm too tired to think about this tonight. I need to get some sleep. I threw her a hard look. You can stay here if you want. She looked at me carefully again. Are you asking me to? No, I said. My emotions are still too strong. But right now I feel like my whole life is falling apart and everything I believed in was a lie. I just, it would be nice to have a friend here if that's not too much to ask. I took the master bedroom and she retired to one of the guest bedrooms. But one night she came into my room and crawled under the covers. I was glad because I really needed someone in the midst of all the pain, lies, and betrayal. She seemed to need me too, and we snuggled up to each other like two shipwreck survivors. Eventually, we both fell asleep. The next morning, I was making breakfast when she appeared in the kitchen in her success suit. As I set her plate down, she asked, How are you feeling this morning, Mark? Not so good, I answered her honestly. I've gone from a widower who just lost the woman he loved to a man who found out that his wife may never have loved him at all. I continue to toss and turn between grief and anger, and honestly, I'm not sure how much more I can take. As she listened, I was touched to see tears in her eyes. So this is what empathy looks like, I thought in surprise. Thank you for staying last night, I told her. The more I learned about what was going on, the more I felt like I didn't have a friend in this world. It was very lonely. Having you here helped. She walked over to me and hugged me. I'm glad I could help, Mark, but you should know that I stayed because I wanted to, not just because you needed me. After a moment, I let her go. What are your plans now? I asked. Can you stay? No, she replied. I'll have to leave, and I'd better do it before we give your neighbors something to gossip about. It's probably too late, I said, but it doesn't matter. She looked at me carefully. What are you going to do, Mark? Don't worry, I assured her. I'm not going to do anything stupid. I just need to get some answers to some of my last few questions. She started to say something, but then changed her mind. I have to go back to Oklahoma City today, she said. Now that we've confirmed Bonnie's death was accidental, the insurance money will be deposited into your account. I nodded, even though under the circumstances the money meant nothing to me. I'd think about what to do with it later. I'd like to know what you'll find out, she continued. I mean, when it's all over. I'd really like to, if you want to. She stopped, not knowing what to say. I understand, I said. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead she came over and kissed me gently on the lips. Good luck, Mark, she said, and walked away. I felt a prick when she left. I felt better when she was with me. But I had to take the next step alone, and now the anger I had been suppressing within me began to build. Checking my watch again, I negotiated and got into the car. And I didn't want to risk entering the Miller's property, so I parked on the side of the road a mile or two from the entrance. When I saw the green truck approaching, I started the engine and pulled out in front of it in what I thought was the last safe moment. From the frantic maneuver to avoid colliding with me, he drove into the ditch. I slowed down in front of his truck so he couldn't pull away easily and then jumped out of the car. He looked at me out the window with a look of amazement that changed to fear when he recognized me. Get out of the car, Holden, shouted I. Get out or I'll break the window and drag you out into the street, I repeated, waving the tire iron I held in my hand. I thought I would have to carry out my threat, but then his shoulders slumped and a look of submission appeared on his young face. He unlocked the door, pushed it open, and slowly walked out to stand next to his truck. He didn't look like he'd grown out of his high school picture. I must have been 4 inches taller and 30 pounds heavier. Go ahead and hit me, he said sullenly. You can destroy me if you want, I don't care. You can't hurt me any more than I've already hurt you. She's gone, and I'll never see her again. I grabbed his arm. I won't hurt you if I don't have to, I told him. I just need you to come with me and answer a few questions. I walked him to the car and pushed him into the passenger seat. He looked unconcerned, but I held the tire iron so I could reach it easily in case his mood changed. I jerked the steering wheel sharply and drove back toward Millersville. As soon as we touched down, I turned and looked at him. When did it start? I demanded. When you and her first... He looked at me like I was an idiot. Started? We've always had a crush on each other, even in high school. She and I were going to get married after college as soon as we had enough money to settle down. But then you showed up and started courting her, and her old man said she had to be nice to you for the sake of the town. He looked at me defiantly. She tried to say no. She loved me, not you. Then his eyes lost their fire. But she loved her old man too, and he kept hounding her, telling her it was her duty, that she had to do it if she loved him. She could never refuse Papa, he said bitterly. But she never said no to me either, he said proudly. So her papa worked it out. I was supposed to live in Arrow Point so no one would ever see Bonnie and me together. But he gave me a job at his house, and I drove to the ranch very early every morning. She'd drive out of town like she was going to her job at Arrow Point. Then she'd come back to the ranch to be with me. But she was traveling to her job at Arrow Point, I objected. I talked to her supervisor. Of course she traveled, Holder replied in despair. She had to make it look real. But she only worked there during the day and spent time with me in the mornings. I still don't get it. Why all the coming and going? Why didn't she just meet you at Arrow Point? He shook his head in disgust. Her father said we couldn't be together where people might see us and start gossiping. But I think he just wanted us under his control. Then his face took on an expression of contempt. Her old man was a real underdog. As soon as Bonnie left for work, he'd make me plow the ranch like a dog all day. But when she'd go to your place in Millersville in the evening, I'd go back to Arrow Point. We'd pass each other on the road and always did the heart of the prairie to show that we loved each other even when we were apart. I looked at him again and saw how misery distorted his youthful expression. That night when the accident happened, her father made me work late doing some stupid chores around the house. I thought I'd pass her closer to Millersville, but she wasn't there. He began to cry openly, tears running down his cheeks like water down a spillway. I came across an accident just a mile or so this side of the river. At first I didn't realize who it was, I just knew it was bad. But when I got close enough, I recognized her Honda, or what was left of it. The front end was all mangled, and she was driving it. Oh my God, Doc, her arm was blown off. When I called her name, she opened her eyes and looked at me and smiled. And then she died. He broke down then and started sobbing. And even though I hated him as my rival for Bonnie, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. I'm probably the first person he could tell his story to, I thought. He's had to keep it to himself all this time. It's a wonder he can function at all. You're the one who put a cross on the highway, I said. He was too emotional to answer, but I knew it had to be true. That's why it says Bonnie Miller and not Bonnie Robertson. I said more to myself than to him. After a while, he recovered a little and started talking again. It seemed he just needed to talk it out. I called 911, but I didn't stick around because I didn't want to ruin Bonnie's life. He looked at me with hunted eyes. When I got back to my truck, Doc, oh my God, I found her hand. He started sobbing again. I couldn't get anything more out of him after that. We pulled into Millersville, and I drove straight to the courthouse on the square. When I parked the car, I walked around it, opened the door, and gently asked him to come with me. He didn't resist. I'm not sure he even realized where he was at that moment. There was a meeting sign hanging on the door of the council chambers, but I pushed it open anyway. Richard Miller looked at me in surprise, but immediately smiled. Come in, Dr. Robertson. We have just been discussing an important matter and would welcome your wise counsel. No, I said. I have an important matter to discuss with you. With all of you. With these words, I turned and invited Holden Calloway to enter. Miller turned pale as Holden appeared in the doorway, and I thought it particularly telling that the others at the table gasped as well. They all knew, I thought. They're all in on it. The first to come to his senses was Miller. Look, Mark, I don't know what that boy has been telling you, but you don't have to lie to me, Richard, I said stiffly. I know the whole story now, the whole story. You were desperate to find a new doctor in Millersville to stay this time. You were so desperate you were willing to sell your own daughter. I paused to look at the others. And any of you would do the same to your own daughters. That's not fair, Miller replied. What father wouldn't want his daughter to marry a fine doctor who is respected in the community and who can provide her with a trouble-free existence? All I wanted was Bonnie's happiness. If you really cared about Bonnie's happiness, You would have let her marry the man she really loves, I said angrily, jabbing my thumb at Holden. But no, you tried to get her to leave him for me. And when she didn't want to give him up, you set Holden up on the side. You turned him into a mistress of sorts and me into a gutless cuckold, and you all knew it. He put his hands up in the air as if to reassure me. Mark, I know you're upset right now, but you have to look at this from a broader perspective. This town has over 100 years of history. We're trying to preserve the traditions of small-town America, a legacy to leave to the next generation. Bullshit, I interrupted him. You weren't interested in tradition or heritage. All you cared about was preserving the value of your ranch. I turned to look at the other commissioners, pointing at them in turn. And you were worried about the value of your car dealership. And you just wanted the assets in your bank to grow. And you were worried about sales at your store. I shook my head. All of you don't care about your sons and daughters and their future. All you care about is your own assets and how to preserve them. But a town without a doctor is a town that dies, Miller said weakly. You don't understand, I said stiffly. Your city is already dead. It's rotten through and through, and so is the morality of its leaders. I can't wait to get out of here. You all make me sick. You can't leave, Miller gasped. If you leave now, you'll owe the government a lot of money. I grinned. The money from the life insurance policy you bought for Bonnie should cover that debt, I told him. And if there's anything left over, Holden Calloway can take the rest. I don't want your blood money. I left them sitting at the table, silent and looking at each other. I walked out to my car and checked the trunk to make sure my bags hadn't moved and I hadn't forgotten anything important. I then set off in the direction of Arrow Point. As I approached the crash site, I stopped and got out of my car to stand in front of the small, uneven cross one last time. I realized now that Bonnie had never loved me, but I loved her, and it would take me a while to come to terms with that. At the same time, I hated her for cheating on me, but I felt sorry that she had to give up on someone she truly loved. It would take me a long time to get over all these conflicting emotions. Maybe Oklahoma City will help me get through this, I thought. I pointed the car that way and pulled onto a long, narrow highway that ran right through the heart of the prairie. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.